Hi, my name's Julie Judd, and I'm going to outline a little bit of my history. I grew up in East Bentley, which is near Moorabbin, and I had deaf parents, and both my parents, who were deaf, didn't come from deaf families. So my grandparents on both sides are hearing, and all of the rest of my family are not deaf. I have a younger sister who's also an interpreter. I didn't say, but I am an interpreter and have been for the last 30 odd years. So I grew up in East Bentley, and I was fortunate enough to have another deaf family living up the road, the Wood family. And there were 3 children around my age that I grew up with, and 2 of them went to the mainstream school that I went to. And at that time there were no interpreters in mainstream schools, and it was quite unusual for them to be going to the same school as me. But David was the same age as me, David Wood, and he was not allowed to be put in the same class as me because we both could communicate in sign language. So they separated us, which is quite interesting. Anyway, I went to that school until I left primary school, and I then went to Bentley High School, and Heather, who was the other sibling from that family, was a year older and in a year higher than me, and we remain friends to this day actually. And when I left school, I left in year 10, and I left home quite early, and I was living with my aunt and uncle in Eltham. And my uncle, at the time I was working in a jewellery store, and my uncle, who was a teacher, noticed in the advertisements for teaching positions that there was a job for a sign language interpreter. And he said to me, "Oh, you'd be good at this because you're really good with your hands." And I looked at it, and I didn't know what an interpreter was. Back then there was no such position or job that I'd ever heard of. And I thought, oh, well, yeah, I can sign. So I applied for the job, and it was at what was then known as Heidelberg High School, and it was the first mainstream setting for deaf kids in secondary schools. So I applied for the job and got the job, and then basically learnt on the job what it meant to be an interpreter. At that time it was signed English that was strongly encouraged, and I found that really difficult in some respects, but listened to the teachers of the deaf at the time who said that this was the way that deaf children would learn to be articulate in English. And so I thought, well, you know, they know best, so I learnt signed English in a matter of a month. It was a green dictionary that I read from front to the back and memorised all of the signs for each of the words. And some years later, Auslan was coined as a language of Australia, and then the revolution began, I guess, and the acceptance of Auslan as a true language became more prominent, and interpreting qualifications through NAATI began, which I attained my level 2 back then, as it was called, paraprofessional, and then a couple of years later I attained my level 3. And since that time I've had various jobs, and I've gone on to study at Macquarie University, my postgraduate in interpreting, translating, and then my master's just recently. And about a year and a half ago I was fortunate enough to be awarded conference level interpreting through NAATI. So that's just a brief snapshot of my history. I hope it's interesting.